Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the session today. I'm hot on the heels of yesterday's publication, Understanding Scotland's Economy, which is a new research piece that we've done with Diffley Partnership, and Mark Diffley is here with us today. Now, as you may have noticed, for anyone attending, this is a very timely space, which my original notes has said to reflect on the Chancellor's earlier announcements. However, they didn't happen at 11:30 as we expected. They're now happening at 12:30, so in the middle of this session. So what we're going to do is rapidly adjust our timings and how we run the event. So you may see a bit of flexibility as we go through the event. So this piece of research is the beginning of a partnership between the David Hume Institute and the Diffley Partnership. We're going to track public perceptions on the economy over time and report back each quarter to monitor people's understanding of the people's understanding and their economic expectations, their spending intentions, and the attitudes that are in Scotland. And we think this is vital information that will really help decision makers across all sectors in Scotland. A link to the research is in the Zoom chat if you'd like to find out more about the work and you haven't had a chance to read it already. Now, just a few things about how the event will run before we start. The event's being recorded and it will be available on the website afterwards. There'll be approximately 15 minutes of presentations before we move on to questions. And if you do have a question for Rachel, please do get in quick because Rachel may be called off to comment on media as she's on call. Please ask any questions you've got in the Q&A and we'll ask you to unmute and ask your questions in your own words. Now, just in case you've not come across Mark before, Mark is a researcher with over 20 years experience. After 10 years as Director of Ipsos MORI in Scotland, Mark set up a new business in 2017, delivering research and insights for clients across the public, private and third sectors in Scotland and also further afield. And Rachel has now got a new role within IPPR. She is an associate director and works across the whole of the UK, where she leads their research across employment, health, care, education and social security. And Rachel will be giving us a particular context to the research today in terms of what's happening across the rest of the UK. So without further ado, on to Mark to give us the outline of the research.
Thanks very much, Susan. May I say to begin with how delighted I am to be here and to be working for us to be working with the David Hume Institute on this. This is what's going to be, we hope, a regular sort of quarterly feature, which adds something to the research and knowledge environment in Scotland, a regular pulse check on how people are feeling about their their own financial situation and the economy at large. And it feels very timely to be beginning that conversation today and with this research. I hope everyone can see my screen. Please shout if you can't. I'm going to, in around 10 minutes, just give a flavour of the survey's result, a quick overview, and then pass across to Rachel, and then she and I can answer any questions that folk may have at that point. So a quick flavour, you may have read the report from our website, you may have seen some coverage of this research in the media and on the David Hume Institute website over the last day or two. But just to reinforce, this is data from a large-scale survey, so of over 2,000 respondents, from a nationally representative survey from across Scotland. And it is very recent. So the fieldwork was carried out within the last couple of weeks. So it's as up-to-date and contemporary as we can. So we're confident that this provides both a timely and robust view of where people are feeling their economic and financial situation is at present. So onto the results, and just to set the context here, what we ask in this survey, one of the questions we ask to set the scene is, what is it that people are worried about? What do people feel are the priorities for the country at the moment? And I think, unsurprisingly, what you can see from this first slide here is that issues around the cost of living and inflation are now the most important issue that people are concerned about. What you'll see is that between January and May, January being the last time we ran the survey, and May being this wave of the survey, of course. The cost of living inflation is now seen as amongst the top 3 priorities for pretty much half of the population. So while our worries about COVID have now almost disappeared, even if COVID itself hasn't, the extent to which we're worried about it is rapidly disappearing. That has now been replaced with significant worries around the cost of living and inflation. So I guess, not surprising, but I think it does sort of set the scene for the data that we'll explore now. I mean, I should say, for those that have seen the data already, this is pretty hard data to look at. It is almost unremittingly negative about where we're at, or people feel we're at the moment. And I think that's very much the context in which we have to look at this data. And of course, in the absence of what may be coming later on and subsequently in terms of help from the government, this is very much, I think, a kind of call to action, and it should be a wake-up call for policymakers and decision makers. We can now see that 84% say that economic conditions they think have worsened over the last 12 months. 3 in 5 think that they will deteriorate further in the next 12 months. 62% of people in Scotland, of adults in Scotland, feel worse off than they did a year ago, and around 6 in 10, 59%, expect their financial circumstances to worsen over the next 12 months, compared to only 7% saying that they will get better. I think perhaps one of the most, one of the starkest statistics from the survey is that among those who already feel worse off, about 8 in 10 of them feel that they're going to become even worse off in the next 12 months. So this is a kind of perpetual feeling that people have. People aren't, I don't think, looking at this as a kind of a one-off hit. People are preparing themselves, however reluctantly, for the fact that this may go on for quite some time. And when we dig a bit deeper into the data, 23% of those in the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland feel much worse off. And that compares to only 13% in the most affluent areas of Scotland. We also find that over 3/4 of the unemployed and those who are unable to work, for instance, because of disabilities, are particularly struggling. People with children and people in larger households are also more likely to say that they're struggling. But actually, while those groups are feeling the pinch particularly badly, it is true to say that a majority of people in every demographic group is feeling worse off, and including in all forms of employment. A job may be a bit of shelter from the worst of what's happening at the moment, but having a job does not mean that you don't feel worse off, because even those in work are telling us that they are feeling worse off than they were and expect to do so again in the future. And we can see some of that from this slide here, which is quite a stark illustration, I think, of where we're at the moment, and the breakdown between different age groups and different social class groups as well. A pretty negative picture. So what we can also say, because we ask about income and the extent to which people's income, whether earned from employment or benefits, is covering their day-to-day living. And you won't be surprised, given the tone of the data so far, that this also shows a significant decline here as well. So 55% are dissatisfied with the extent to which their income covers their living costs. That's up by 18 percentage points since September. This rises to around, so the 55% rises to around over 60% for those in the most disadvantaged areas of the country. And the majority of people in all forms of paid work tell us that they're dissatisfied with this as well. So reinforcing my point, I think, from earlier, that having a job and having income from a job is not a guarantee at this stage of being able to continue with a standard of living that perhaps you may have previously been used to. And people's ability to meet living costs, as we can see here, has dropped, and it's dropped particularly sharply among people who live in the most deprived areas of the country. Okay, and we can see that from this slide here, where we can see particular falls, particularly sharp falls in income adequacy related to the index of multiple deprivation. Finally, from me, before handing back to Susan, and these are the issues that I think have been extensively covered in the media in the last couple of days. What impact is this having? How are people responding to the cost of living crisis? And we can see here the kind of hierarchy of impacts that it's having. The one that's particularly caught the eye, I think, is that around, you can see sort of about a third of the way down this graphic, is around a quarter, sorry, of people tell us that they are actually losing sleep due to stress or anxiety about their personal finances. That's around 1 million people in Scotland. That is a pretty shocking statistic, I think, and one I think when I saw this data really was the kind of sit up and take notice piece of data that I saw. It's not the only stark statistic here, but I suspect some of the other impacts that the cost of living is having is possibly a little more obvious or predictable. People cutting down, so the majority of us cutting down on non-essential purchases, not putting the heating on when we otherwise would have done so. We're cutting down on leisure activities. And many of us as well are either skipping meals or cutting down our portion sizes in order to save money. We see these impacts across demographic groups. Again, we see particular spikes amongst the already disadvantaged, who are being particularly hard hit by having to take some of these measures. But it's really it's pretty much happening to everyone to some degree or other. So that's what the data tells us. That's the position, I think, in Scotland. It's a pretty negative picture. We will clearly be monitoring this, as I said at the beginning, every quarter to see how things change. But at the moment, it looks to us very much like this is the general public are pretty negative about the position and are not expecting a great deal to change within the next 12 months, but we shall see. Susan, back to you.
Thanks, Mark. And swiftly on to Rachel, as someone's pointed out in the chat, the Chancellor is on the blocks at the moment, making the intro sounding. So we'll whiz on to your, so you've got some slides, I think, haven't you?
Yes, thanks very much. I'm not, oh, I think you can see my notes rather than slides. Can you see a slide on your screen now? I'm assuming that's a yes, but please shout over.
Yes,
it's not good. That's okay.
Thanks,
thanks very much. And this is the first time I've had to directly compete with Rishi Sunak announcing how he's going to spend the energy profits levy he's just announced. So I'll keep it fairly brief. So most of all, I wanted to welcome a really incredibly valuable and timely report from the Institute and from Diffley Partners. I think does a really excellent job of telling the story of this moment that really is, kind of historic standing. And the impact that it's actually having on people's lives. And I think the variety of the data that's captured in this study looking at the actual impact in kind of household finances, but obviously how it's actually being experienced. The piece Mark was just speaking to in terms of the financial stress this is placing on families and on households is an incredibly important insight in understanding how we navigate this crisis and what an appropriate response should look like, and also kind of how we see the impact of the policy responses that are being announced as we speak, from Westminster at least. So I thought I'd kind of do a quick recap on where we are, at least up until this current moment, and how we got there. So we know that inflation's at a 30-year high, and wages and benefits, as there's been a lot of policy debate around recently, are not keeping up with rising costs. We know that 90% of households across Britain have reported a rise in living costs in April when that price cap was increased. And we know that the October price cap rise that's planned is likely to result in a lot more financial pain and huge amounts of stress for households, really quite broadly across the income spectrum. But we also know that those households that Mark was describing that are typically on lower incomes are the most exposed to this crisis, and that has a direct impact on major policy agendas in Scotland, like particularly those child poverty targets that we're hurtling towards through increasingly uncertain economic waters. So we know that the OBR have warned of the largest fall in living standards since the 1950s. So this is really significant. And energy firms have warned last month, I should say, that 40% of people in Britain could fall into fuel poverty this winter. So really, a really dramatic kind of state of play. And we're hearing exactly what that looks like in Scotland from this really valuable research. I want to pull up particularly the findings around the fact that this crisis isn't hitting everyone equally, that there are particular families, people in particular places across Scotland that are more exposed, are feeling this more acutely already. We're seeing that around people who are out of the labour market altogether, particularly people who are unemployed, but those people who are sick or disabled and not able to be in the labour market full time or on a permanent basis. We're seeing a massive challenge from the lack of response so far, fingers crossed it might be announced as I've been speaking, a lack of progress on social security and the strength of our safety net, obviously so much of which is still reserved to government at Westminster. And the threat of benefits not increasing in line with these rising costs is posing a direct kind of link to rising or prospective rising destitution and deep poverty in the really concerning circumstances that we're hearing of day by day, families having to choose between putting food on the table or heating their homes. And we know that families with children, that larger families, and particularly those kind of priority family groups that we're seeing the Scottish Government put a major focus on through its child poverty delivery plan, those are the same families that are going to be particularly exposed to this crisis often, those that see higher heating costs in particular. So how did we get here? So we've seen dramatic rises in energy prices for months. We know that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has put a huge amount more volatility into those markets. And we're seeing this rise in energy bills at the petrol pump, but particularly, as I said, after this energy price cap rise. And also, I think it's worth saying that these are kind of wider inflationary pressures now. So we're seeing them in supermarkets, but also across things like clothing, shoes, furniture costs, major kind of household everyday items that are costing more when incomes are staying the same. And that poses a bit of a policy question or policy quandary around some of the measures we rely on, measures like relative poverty that's reliant on incomes, don't particularly capture a moment like this when the real economic pressure is coming from rising costs rather than an income shock. So making sure that we've got tools to gain insights like through this report are really even more valuable in that context when some of the measures we usually rely on aren't as responsive to a crisis of this nature. I wanted to touch briefly on kind of how Scotland compares to the rest of the UK. So obviously a lot of these major challenges that I'm outlining here, they're UK wide or even beyond the UK as well. But we have seen some measures in Scotland that mean that families might be more resilient in some cases, marginally so, to the kind of challenges they're facing, to things like the new Scottish Child Payment, some of the kind of devolved benefit measures that we're seeing that will be getting more cash to families. And we know that any increase in household support is going to make something of a difference given the income shortfalls we're expecting families to face between their current incomes and the rising bills that they're having to absorb. And we have seen measures like better targeted support through council tax relief and those sorts of measures that begin to make a difference. But because of the scale of income shortfalls, we're expecting to see a lot of the powers to really make a difference obviously do lie with the Chancellor. And then finally, what we've kind of come into this crisis on the back of is a decade of stagnant living standards, and that lack of progress on living standards really matters for the implications of this crisis in terms of how people are feeling it in their finances, but also in terms of the wider political and social implications of a major living standards crisis like this one, coming on the back of households often not having very much left to cut back on. And that's what we're seeing in the deepening poverty picture in households that were already struggling to pay for the bare minimum, now having to cut back on things that that no one should be expected to cut back on, like food, like fuel costs. And finally, in terms of wider implications for this moment in time, so they've got a real threat of deepening poverty, as I was just describing, but also a wider threat to economic stability. So if we see households unable to be paying basic bills, and we're also going to see households that are unable to go and spend money in the high street, in their local economies across Scotland, and that's going to make a really big, an increasing threat of potential recession, and longer term, another lost decade for living standards. And that lack of progress, I think, really will be felt in terms of how people experience their lives day to day, as we've heard from Mark. And also how they experience trust in government, both at Holyrood and at Westminster. So how much trust people place in the governments that lead the countries they live in, to make a positive difference to their lives. And that brings us into broader questions of democracy and the kind of political dynamics across Scotland and how those might play into each other in this crisis. But I'll leave it there and no longer try and compete with Rishi Sunak. And yeah, look forward to some questions, but I might have to hop off in a minute, I'm afraid. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rachel. That was fantastic to see all that context. I am just going to check. Mark, you need to turn your camera on again. Can you? Are you there? Can you hear me? Fantastic. Brilliant. Right, we'll open it up into discussion now. So just before we lose you, Rachel, I'm quite keen to ask, because Rishi is making announcements. I'll detail some of those in shortly, but I'm really interested in the longer term structural things you came on at the beginning with. So we are seeing in the data that Mark gathered, there are 32% of people drawing on savings, but we already know from the previous data that there's a high proportion of people with no savings, and another really high proportion of people that don't have any money left at the end of each month. So we've got a system where there's very little resilience within it. And what we're getting now, it looks like, is some help to the people that really need it. But how do we move that system so that more people have more resilience, that when these future crises and shocks do come, which we know they will, how can we move that?
Yeah, I think that's, it's all right if I go first, Mark, before I disappear. I think that's the kind of £1 million question, isn't it? But I think you're totally right. The resilience is the challenge here, that we know that households don't have shock absorbers to, I think with a £700 kind of typical energy bill increases, people are very unlikely to have shock absorbers that are that big. But coming into this crisis, we knew that we were not resilient enough as a society to even deal with smaller scale economic shocks, things like cars breaking down, like your fridge stopping working. Those are the kind of events that could tip many households across Scotland kind of over the edge into real precarity. And what can we do to respond to that? I think there's kind of three core elements as we see it from an IPPR Scotland perspective. The first is wages. That's an integral part of this picture. It's the biggest component part, and that lost decade of living standards increases the lack of progress on real wages. That's a UK-wide problem, not a Scotland-specific problem, but that is shared in Scotland. That really makes a very big difference to the kind of picture we're seeing here. And we have seen, kind of an emphasis on fair pay on the Scottish Government's agenda, but I think we've not seen, probably the kind of the muscular policy response that we need to be able to make sure that doesn't continue. And there's a real risk that if we're on the same trajectory for the next decade, that puts us in a very different position in terms of what living standards look like in this country. So plenty to do there, and I refer you to some IPPR Scotland research published last year that looks at that kind of question holistically. And another part is services, so having a look at what role public services can play in reducing core costs. So things like childcare that we know are really significant challenges for families, things like transport costs as we look towards the net zero agenda, and looking at how you can bring down those core costs to better insulate families against shocks like these. And the third element for lower income families in particular is social security, and what our social security system within Scotland can do to try and mitigate against some of the wider challenges we're seeing with insufficient levels of social protection for families that really rely on that. And we know an increasing chunk of those families are families in work. So it's obviously there's a huge amount of interplay between those three different parts, but that's where we'd be looking first.
Thanks, Rachel. One more question before I come to Mark. So it looks like there's a one-off payment of £650 to those on the lowest income via 2 payments direct to bank accounts. There's another one-off payment of £300 for pensioners in receipt of winter fuel payment, and a one-off payment of £150 to people in receipt of disability benefit. Is that what you were kind of expecting? Because a lot of this was trailed out in advance.
Yeah, so the £600 in kind of 2 installments is what I think most people were expecting from this morning. This has obviously been quite a fast-moving kind of policy environment, and that's welcome in that it's more ambitious in scale than I think we were previously expecting. We've kind of modelled that a kind of typical family with, I think, 2 children would experience £700 shortfall this year, and so £600 obviously goes really much further than previous support announced would do to close that gap. But I think that in terms of that longer picture view that you're outlining, Susan, the challenge remains that particularly for lower income families whose wages aren't going far enough to make ends meet day by day, and particularly as we look towards next year, where we might have inflation continuing. Bank of England estimates are 5% inflation next year too. If prices continue to rise, we'll need more than a kind of a sticking plaster emergency response, and we'll have to look more holistically at our system, but what we're doing around wages, around social security levels, to make sure families are better insulated. And I'll hop off with that one, but really sorry to miss the rest.
That's all right. Thanks, Rachel. We will let you go and do your 1 o'clock news.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
All right.
Thanks very much. Right now, Mark, you're going to get all the hard questions now, I'm afraid. But there's a question from Peter Ricci. Peter, are you able to unmute and ask your question directly of Mark?
Thank you. I can now that the button arrived for me to do so.
It's magic, Peter.
Very much is, yeah. So I'm not even sure this is a well-formulated question as ever, but a lot of what people are concerned about is clearly about their own finances at the minute. And maybe you picked up on this just before, Susan, but do we have any sense to separate out that very real concern about people's finances from their thinking about the wider economy, which we tend to spend our time on these sorts of chats thinking more about?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Peter. I mean, that's definitely why Mark and I are working together on this, because it feels like too often the conversations are separate and there are such big implications for what individuals are intending to do with their money for the bigger picture of the economy. Mark, do you want to, I'll hand over to you and shut up, but it's something I'm quite passionate about.
No, I don't think it's a daft question at all. I think it's a very relevant question, Peter. And I think and the truth is, just from a sort of data point of view, but if you ask sort of any 2 questions and they get such high proportions of people having the sort of same view. So, the vast majority of people think that the economy is going to hell in a handcart, and the vast majority of people think that their own personal finances are deteriorating, then there is just likely to be a huge overlap between the two. So you're extremely you're much more likely to, if you think your personal finances are in a bad shape, you're much more likely to think that the economy is also in a bad shape, and vice versa. I think people are kind of particularly worried about their own financial situations at the moment. And I think that's where the focus has to be. And I think what Rachel was saying just a moment ago as a sort of an immediate response to kind of what the Chancellor was saying was pretty welcome, in that, she seems to be saying that this is a relatively significant announcement. I mean, we know that what people's priorities are in terms of government action is just getting money into their pockets as quickly as possible, right? So some money being paid directly into your bank account, whenever that might be, hopefully pretty soon, is kind of the fastest, quickest, and most effective way of actually getting people through, able to pay some of the bills, the increased bills that they're now facing. And I know, from speaking to kind of policy colleagues, that was very much the thinking at the UK government. How can we get this done as quickly as possible in terms of getting the money out to people? I think the point about households kind of falling over and getting into serious issues if an unexpected bill comes in or things go up, I mean, it's a very well made one. And I can't remember the exact numbers now, I'm afraid, but we did a piece of research with Money Advice Scotland last year, which was around, a part of which was around looking at, well, if you received a one-off bill for this amount of money, what impact would that have on you? And in fact, it was a lot less than for a lot of families, for a lot of households, getting an unexpected bill for a lot less than £700, if something broke or your car needed an emergency repair or something like that, would actually cause them great difficulty. So you can see that things going up by an average of £700 is really quite significant. And I think that's borne out in all our data and has led to this absolutely overwhelming sense. It's very rare to get such stark numbers coming back. So absolutely overwhelming numbers of people being so spooked by what's going on, and I think that's exactly what is happening. So let's see what impact the announcements today might have when we sort of revisit this in a couple of months' time.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, to take Peter's point further, the bit that is really worrying me, I'm really worried about the loss of sleep, because the public health costs for that long term of living in acute stress we know have major health implications. But the bit that is the really worrying thing for me is the people already cutting back on their spending, both on non-essentials and on leisure activities, and the knock-on effect that will have for Scotland's business base, if it's already doing it now and we haven't even hit the peak. So the Chancellor's announcements, I think, will be really interesting, and it does seem the announcements are still coming out, so there is a whole basket of things, which, if anyone's read the blog that I tried to write last night to put this in context, it is a basket of measures, but targeted at quite a wide population, because when you look at the numbers in the research, Mark, it's not a minority that are living in this precarious state. It's quite a large tranche of people, and like you said, it's uniform, across ages, and it's not that one group is okay and everyone else is fine. I'm sorry, the opposite of that.
Yeah, I get that point, and I think also people are making choices about the future as well, because they're expecting this to go on, right? So there is a kind of an immediate impact. So I'll buy less in my weekly shop this week, or but actually people are going to make more significant long-term cutbacks or attempts at efficiencies as well. And I think that's almost as worrying. I mean, it's not the kind of immediate impact for households is the most worrying thing, obviously. But if I'm not an economist, or never sort of claim to be, but if you are and you look at projections, whether that's for growth, employment, inflation, or whatever, looking at kind of human behavior and consumer behavior, and what they tell people like us in surveys like this, should really be quite a worry as well, because there is no kind of light at the end of the tunnel. And often when we do this type of research, we're quite used to communicating negative findings, but there are usually in surveys like this some kind of glimmers of hope. If this happens, things might get better, or I can see a bit of light in the long term. But that just doesn't, at the moment, I'm afraid, that just doesn't exist.
And we should reassure people, shouldn't we, Mark? We did look for those glimmers of hope.
We did. We absolutely
looked really hard.
did.
We didn't want it to be a negative picture. We wanted there to be some news there.
you know, as many people on this call will know, there are sheets and sheets of numbers and data, and there is not, as far as I can see, a single number in this data which would give me any kind of cause for some optimism. Now, again, the point is that this is, you know, the survey was done before these announcements today, so it may be that they have some impact, and people, you know, I have to say we haven't asked this in the survey, but I suspect some of the pessimism may be because they didn't feel the government was on their side or doing anything or paying sufficient attention to this, and we see that in some other polling data about trust in the economy and so forth. So it might be that, as well as actually hitting people with some money, that people might kind of suddenly think, oh well, actually, you know, they are now sort of, albeit belatedly, paying attention. That may make people, or some people at least, feel a little bit reassured over that issue. But you know, the kind of reverse of that is that, as we know, for anyone who's sort of paying attention to you know, what we're being told, particularly about energy prices, you know, they're going to go up again, probably by even more in October than they just have when the cap is lifted further. So, you know, as we go into winter, and you know, people will need to use more heating. So, you know, people know that, right? People can see that, and so that also accounts, I think, for the sort of unremitting sort of pessimism that we see at the moment.
One of the things Rachel touched on was differences between the rest of the UK and Scotland. And the one that struck me is because our climate is generally colder and wetter, but we also have a higher proportion of people using oil heating rather than mains gas or anything like that. And so that makes people even more worried when they can see those costs ranking up. I'm going to put someone in the audience on the spot now, as I sometimes do, and come to Alistair Ross. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to gather your thoughts, Alistair. But the other thing that thinking about structurally going ahead is we've got so many people living on the edge now, you know, with essentials, trying to put food on the table and heat their homes. And that peace of mind about having insurance, I wonder, working in that field, Alistair, are you able to unmute and say anything about what trends you're seeing in the insurance market?
Yeah, thanks very much, Susan, and thank you very much both to Mark and to Rachel for making the time and for sharing your thoughts with us today, which is incredibly helpful. Pretty bleak in some aspects, and that's not a criticism, but that's where we are. That's just a personal observation. But yeah, I mean, in terms of insurance and indeed financial services more generally, I mean, this is something that's been talked about across the industry. You know, coming off the back of a pandemic where there had to be a lot of adaptation and a lot of flexibility shown across financial services. I think that intention, that spirit's continuing, which is a positive thing. And it's really about, as I say, it's about being flexible. I mean, I know a number of firms are doing things like refreshing the training that they're providing for customer-facing colleagues on how you go about supporting people who are financially vulnerable. And I think a big part of this current situation is it will affect those who are at the lower end of income scales, but who are already used to a degree of financial pressure and have developed a degree of financial resilience. But I think this is also going to touch households and groups that haven't really undergone that pressure before and are having to really start adapting to it now, whether you may be in a higher income bracket but significantly extended in terms of your credit and debt. And you know, there is a real risk now that people could tip, for want of a better term, into real financial trouble. So there's a lot of thinking and a lot of action going on. But the overall thing that I keep coming back to in this is I described it as a cost of living crisis in a meeting, and somebody politely but firmly pushed back on me and said, it's not a crisis. This isn't going to be over in, you know, a matter of weeks. You know, this isn't going to be a couple of months thing. You know, if we look at the expectations around inflation, you know, it's still going to be sticking at either very high single or even double digit levels towards the end of the year and beyond. You know, this is a long-term thing. So correspondingly, we need to get out of that mindset that says, right, let's get through the next few weeks and months and all the rest of it. We really need to actually start thinking hard really hard about the longer term and where all this sits. And the points you made about the economic impact, absolutely agree 100%.
Thanks, Alistair. That's really useful. And I think putting the phraseology as well, you know, is the cost of living crisis labeling giving us a short-term mindset, I think is so important. And it was interesting picking up on what Rachel said about the family impact this year being around about £700, I think she said, but that's only taking us till Christmas. You know, what's happening next year? And you can feel that anxiety coming through in the survey, in that people, I think, are smart enough to realize this isn't short term. You know, it's here for a good few years ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I sort of tried to make that point earlier. I think although we didn't directly ask that question, how long do you think this will last? It might be a bit of an unfair question actually to put to people. Everything from the data that we have screams, yeah, long term, whether that's people's kind of pessimism when we ask about, you know, their own finances or the economy as a whole, and I think about some of the behaviours that people are starting to exhibit as well, which I think if people thought this was a kind of just a very short-term hit, they probably would just kind of ride it out and, you know, put it down to experience or whatever. But because they know because it's so severe, and I think you're right that it's going to be long lasting, that, you know, we're starting to see that. We don't need to ask it directly. I think we can just see it from the data. The other thing, of course, that Rachel talked about in terms of possible responses to this is around wages, and we can see from the data that, you know, increasingly people think their salaries are insufficient to cover what's going on. And I actually heard Paul Johnson from the IFS on the radio this morning saying that, you know, what the government decides in terms of public sector wages is pretty much the most difficult decision that it's going to have to make. I mean, much more difficult than whether it implements a windfall tax or, you know, gives a, you know, a one-off payment or a two-off payment to the most deprived households. I'm not sure that bit yet people have kind of quite caught up with that yet. They can see that their wages aren't covering what's going on in the shops and their goods and services at the moment. I'm not sure people realise quite what, particularly in the public sector, quite what wage constraint is going to be and what that might mean and for how long. So I think that's the bit possibly that is still going to be a bit of a shock to the system for a lot of people.
I totally agree, Mark. I think there's many more shocks to come. The one that I haven't seen much talk about at all is the cost of heating public buildings, so everything from schools to hospitals. Yeah. And that is going to have a knock-on impact for every council or every public sector spending budget. So, you know, we're not talking about that. And, you know, we're talking about it in terms of domestic bills at the moment, but the public sector bills are going to be hugely hit by this cost. So, you know, there are going to have to be cuts. You know, there's only, and unless there's some huge tax increase, to manage that, it's going to be very difficult to absorb within budgets without cutting some sort of services. So yeah, a stark picture that Alistair's kind of rightly put in context, that, you know, this is a medium to long-term thing, not a crisis as in short term, over by Christmas and we can all put our feet up and go home. I'm going to put you on the spot, Mark, and slightly say question that I would probably ask you in offline, but let's ask it in public. Is there a question, looking back now you've got the data in, that you wished you asked that we hadn't included, that you definitely want to get in the next one?
Well, I mean, I think maybe having said we don't need to ask the question about how long people think this will last, it might be, you know, even measuring whether you think it's short, medium or long term and what that might mean would be one thing. I might dig into the impacts of this a bit more. I can see someone's put a question in about mental health, which is, well, they've actually put a question about savings, but sort of introduced it by talking about stress and mental health. And I would probably dig a bit deeper. I mean, we have said, you know, which of these which of these are you doing or not doing as a result of the cost of living issue? I won't call it a crisis, but bearing in mind what Alistair just rightly said, but bearing in mind what's going on, and we can measure that, and we can see how it differs between different groups in the population. I think particularly for the lack of sleep or some of the kind of health issues that people identified, and there are physical health issues here as well. So people aren't exercising as much, or people aren't, participating in things as much as they may have done. So there's physical as well as mental health issues going on here. I might ask some sort of follow-up questions to people who've identified that as to what impact that is having and how difficult that is. I wonder as well, although we haven't actually directly asked it, about kind of household relationships and stresses this is putting on, sort of inter-family or intra-family relationships and so on and so forth as well, particularly those with children. I mean, we can see what impact it's having on households with children as opposed to the rest of the population, but we haven't asked about relationships in more detail. So I think from a from a social and public policy point of view, I think maybe some questions a bit more into the impacts that these are having on individuals and on households would be where it would go, I think, from there, because in some ways these are very stark findings about loss of sleep, but you don't know what, and it's related to the financial crisis or the cost of living, but we don't know much more than that. We don't actually know what's going on with these individuals or with these households that is causing them, in detail, what's causing them to have such, extreme anxiety. We know it's happening, but we don't know the absolute root causes of it. So I would probably go down that kind of route, Susan, I think, in terms of what more I would like to know if we'd asked.
Thanks, that's great. The other side of the question you mentioned on mental health, they mentioned pensions, and that's something that feels like another ticking time bomb, because it feels like we already know from all the predictions that people aren't saving enough for their retirement already, and we also know we're ending up with a generation in renting rather than having a home ownership to fall back on. So the costs of housing are going to end up in retirement as well as throughout the rest of the course of life. So it feels like there's much more data there that we need to explore going forward, which is why I'm delighted we're doing this over time and we can track the trend.
Exactly.
There is one more question there from Peter. It snuck in when I was putting Alistair on the spot earlier. So Peter, do you want to unmute that and just ask that in your own words?
I can do. Sorry to hog it at all, but
that's fine. Please do.
It seems to me that a lot of the cost of living non-crisis effect is energy and the knock-ons of energy. And people like me that think about this over probably far too long a period of time are thinking about decarbonisation, at least as a big part of the answer to that. So we're looking for investment from households and businesses in decarbonisation. We're looking for investment from businesses to increase productivity, investment from the public sector and research and innovation. So how do you see that need for investment as the solution in the longer term interacting with all of the things that you've been talking about, which is the need for public spending and businesses to increase wages and to solve the issues in the short term?
Nice, easy question there, Peter. Do you want me to take that one, Mark?
Add a bit at the end, but
I think there is a tension there. You've rightly identified it, where we've got a significant proportion of the population at the moment living in dire circumstances, and the predictions are that that's going to get worse. So I can completely understand the need to put money into that, but I can also understand the things that you're saying, Peter, about we also need long-term investment in the things that are going to change it for future, so that we're not dependent on importing energy in the same way that we are at the moment. So that tension is there. and it means for every decision maker that's making a choice between short-term interventions that will help people that need it now versus, you know, the long-term structural things that we also know need to happen. And particularly, we haven't mentioned the term climate change. We also know the climate impacts in Scotland are going to hit the people that are already being hit by the cost of living crisis. Use that word, having acknowledged that it's a tricky word before. It's going to hit them because they've also got no reserves and no resilience at the moment. So it is a really, really tricky bag of things we've got ahead of us. And I think what it does need is us all to look at problems from different points of view, listen to people from different sectors from ourselves, and try and work together to work our way through the challenges ahead, which I think, as we've seen, not just for individuals but for society, are huge, absolutely huge. So I think for me there's a strong argument there for the David Hume Institute to continually work across sectors, bringing together people with different thinking, to make sure that there is a space to try and do things in a non-political way, because as soon as you get that polarization, it's very hard to look at the nuance in the data, and look at things from another person's point of view. So it's maybe, Peter, a bit of a waffly answer, but I don't think there are any easy ones, and that's kind of means that we've all got to work really hard.
I think from data from businesses, or certainly from public surveys, we've seen concern about the environment. I mean, this is a kind of salience issue, right? But concern about the environment falling, and you saw it from the data I put up recently, but that's replicated in other polls and surveys. And of course, the risk is that, you know, I mean, it's a very straightforward kind of concept, right? But people are quite rightly, I think, prioritizing other things. You know, copper's been and gone, and people are thinking less now about, you know, the environment and saving the planet, frankly, than they are about, you know, getting money in their pockets and getting through this awful period. So I mean, again, that's an obvious answer, but it's just not as salient an issue as it was, say, this time 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm. Right, I'll just double check my screens for questions. There is a detailed one there on structural pricing in the energy market, but I think that goes way beyond the scope of this research. So I'm afraid, Gareth, I'm not going to attempt to open that question, because I just know that neither me or Mark can do it justice. What I will say is there's a really good IFS podcast on the structure of the energy market, and there's also some work from Resolution Foundation on cost of living that's really good. So if you want the detailed impacts of that question, I think they're really good places to look for sources. So I think, unless there's any final words from Mark, is there anything you want to add that you've not said that you'd like to leave people with thinking?
No, not really. I think I've sort of depressed people enough already. So we'll probably leave it at that. I mean, just to say that it's really important data. We'll be doing it every quarter, and this will become a kind of more powerful part of the conversation, I think, as you see more trends developing over time. So, you know, I know there's a lot of people on this call who are very interested in it, because I speak to a lot of them about it. So rest assured, we are on the case in terms of keeping a track of this over a long period. So, you know, and that will hopefully inform the debate much more fully in the future. So, but thank you, Susan, for
that's all right. I'm absolutely delighted to be working with you, and look forward to, hopefully, when we next do this next quarter, there will be some glimmers of light that we'll be able to share with people. But I want to assure people that we are not doing this for doom and gloom. We're doing this so that there is practical information there for decision makers, so that they know what people are thinking and what the implications of their spending choices might be, so that people have got real-time information to make decisions. So I just thank everyone for their time, and look forward to seeing you and reporting back on the next piece of research. I'll also tell that we've got a face-to-face or first hybrid event coming up on the 7th of June with Jason Leach and Jackie Lowe, in conversation about what can we learn from the communication through the COVID crisis, and also I'm pausing every time I say the word crisis now, through COVID, and also particularly about the nuance in communicating in data, which I think is a really tricky thing that lots of us have to do a lot of the time. So, you know, what can we learn from Jason's experience? So thank you very much, Mark, and your team for hard work on this, and thank you to the audience for all your questions. And I think we'll wrap it up there. And if you've enjoyed this, please do come again, because we love having your questions and love spending time with you. So cheerio, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.